Your soulmate is crying over a secret they never wanted you to know. Something about the way your soulmate closed the door tonight made the silence feel louder than anything they could have said. They stood there for several seconds with one hand still resting on the handle, staring at the floor as though they had walked into the room carrying a truth that had suddenly become too heavy to hide. Their phone was still glowing on the table. A message had arrived only moments earlier, but they couldn't bring themselves to read it again. Instead, they turned toward the window, pressed their lips together, and tried to steady their breathing. Then the tears came. Quietly at first. Not because they had stopped caring about you. Not because someone else had taken your place. The reason was far more personal. They were crying because there was something about their feelings for you that they had carefully kept hidden, and tonight, someone unexpectedly reminded them that secrets eventually ask to be spoken. Stay close to this moment, because the message on that phone wasn't the secret. It was only the reason they could no longer pretend the secret didn't exist. Earlier that day, your soulmate had been sitting across from someone who knew them well enough to notice when their smile wasn't real. The conversation had started casually, ordinary questions, ordinary laughter, nothing that seemed important. Then your name came up. Everything shifted. Their eyes moved away. Their fingers tightened slightly around the cup in front of them. The person across the table noticed immediately and asked a simple question: why do you always change when someone mentions them? Your soulmate tried to laugh it away, but the answer wouldn't come. There was a pause. A long one. And then came another question, softer this time: do they even know how much this means to you? That was the moment your soulmate realized what they had been hiding wasn't some dramatic betrayal or shocking mistake. It was vulnerability. They had allowed you to see pieces of their heart, but never the whole thing. They had acted calmer than they felt. They had sometimes created distance when what they really wanted was closeness. They had convinced themselves that revealing the full depth of their emotions would somehow give those emotions the power to hurt them. But there is one detail you haven't seen yet. Someone at that table knew exactly why your soulmate had learned to hide feelings this deeply, and what they said next followed your soulmate all the way home. The words were simple: you keep protecting yourself from something that hasn't happened. Your soulmate didn't answer. They couldn't. Because suddenly they remembered every unfinished conversation with you. Every message they typed and erased. Every moment they wanted to say, "You matter more to me than you realize," only to replace it with something safer. And now, alone in that quiet room, those memories were arriving one after another. They picked up their phone and opened your conversation. Their thumb hovered over the screen. A sentence appeared. Then disappeared. Another sentence. Deleted again. They weren't searching for the perfect words anymore. They were searching for enough courage to finally stop hiding behind imperfect ones. And that's when another tear slipped down their face, because the secret wasn't simply that they cared. It was that somewhere along the way, you had become connected to a future they had quietly imagined but never admitted aloud. Ordinary mornings. Long conversations. Inside jokes nobody else understood. Being able to look across a room and know exactly who they wanted beside them. But before they could send anything, their phone vibrated again. The same person from earlier had sent one final message: if they knew the real reason you've been holding back, would they understand? Your soulmate stared at those words, and for the first time tonight, they didn't delete what they typed next. They began writing the truth, and the first sentence revealed why they had been so afraid for you to know it. The first sentence stayed on the screen for nearly a minute before your soulmate finally allowed themselves to read it back. I kept this from you because I was afraid that if you knew how deeply I cared, everything between us would become real. Their fingers stopped moving. That was it. Not the entire secret, but the doorway into it. They had spent so much time appearing composed around you that you may never have guessed how carefully they remembered the smallest details. The things you mentioned once and forgot, the way your voice changed when something genuinely excited you, the moments when you tried to look fine even though something was clearly weighing on your mind. None of this had been casual to them. And that was precisely what frightened them about admitting it. Earlier, whenever they imagined telling you everything, another thought would interrupt. What if saying it changes the connection? What if the words arrive too soon? What if something beautiful becomes complicated simply because they finally give it a name? So they chose silence, believing silence could preserve what mattered. Tonight they were beginning to understand the opposite. Silence had protected them from vulnerability, but it had also prevented you from knowing what was actually happening behind their guarded expressions. Their eyes filled again as they continued typing. There were times you probably thought I didn't notice you pulling away. I noticed every time. They stopped there, remembering one particular conversation when you had given them an opportunity to open up and they had responded with a few careful words instead. They remembered watching that moment pass and immediately wishing they could call it back. Keep following this thread, because the next thing they wrote wasn't about the past at all. It was about the choice they had already been considering for the future. Your soulmate stood up and began walking slowly across the room, phone still in hand, as though movement might help them organize everything their heart had been keeping in separate locked rooms. They reached the window again, looked at their reflection in the dark glass, and suddenly understood something almost painfully simple. They weren't crying because the secret had been discovered. They were crying because hiding it had become harder than telling it. For weeks, perhaps longer, they had imagined what honesty with you might actually look like. Not a dramatic scene. Not some perfect speech where every sentence landed exactly right. Something quieter. Sitting across from you without pretending. Looking directly into your eyes and admitting, I created distance because this mattered more than I expected. That was the secret beneath the secret. Their hesitation had never automatically meant indifference. In their private emotional world, it had often meant the stakes felt unusually high. And now another memory surfaced, the moment someone once asked them what they wanted their life to feel like a year from now. Your soulmate had avoided mentioning your name, yet almost every detail of the answer somehow included you. Peace. Trust. Laughter. Someone who understood their quieter side. Someone they didn't need to impress. Someone who could recognize the person underneath all the careful defenses. If this story is speaking to you, you're welcome to share your thoughts in the comments, pass the video along to someone who enjoys these emotional stories, or subscribe and stay around for what comes next. Because your soulmate was about to realize that imagining a future was one thing, actually allowing another person to know they were part of that picture required a completely different kind of courage. Then their phone lit up once more, but this time they didn't reach for the incoming message. They were focused entirely on the unfinished words addressed to you. They returned to the chair, wiped their eyes, and began writing faster. I need you to understand something about why I disappeared into myself sometimes. Whenever I felt myself getting closer to you, I became afraid of needing something I couldn't control. They stared at that line, then added another. So I tried to act like I needed less. Suddenly, so many confusing moments seemed to fit together. The short replies after meaningful conversations. The hesitation after unexpectedly warm moments. The times they seemed ready to say something important and then changed the subject. Your soulmate hadn't known how to explain the contradiction inside them, wanting to move closer while instinctively stepping backward whenever their emotions became impossible to dismiss. But tonight, that pattern had finally become visible even to them. And here is where everything shifted. They scrolled upward through your old conversation, stopping at one message from you that they had read countless times in private. Whatever those words represented to them, they had become evidence that perhaps honesty wouldn't destroy the connection after all. Their expression softened. The tears slowed. For the first time that evening, there was something almost hopeful in their face. They returned to the message they had been writing and added one final sentence before their thumb moved toward the send button. There is another reason I've been afraid to tell you all of this, and it has nothing to do with whether I trust you. Their thumb froze inches above the screen. Because that second reason, the one they had never explained to anyone completely, was the part of the secret that could finally make you understand why loving you had brought both hope and hesitation into their heart at exactly the same time. What your soulmate finally admitted to themselves was something they had avoided naming for a long time. The deeper their feelings became, the more they worried they might someday disappoint you. Their thumb moved away from the send button, and for a few seconds they simply stared at the unfinished message. The room was completely still now, except for the faint sound of traffic somewhere beyond the window. They remembered all the times you had seen confidence in them when, privately, they had been questioning whether they could become the person they wanted to be beside you. That was the second reason. They weren't only protecting themselves from rejection, they had been trying to protect the image they thought you had of them. They wanted you to see someone certain, emotionally steady, ready for whatever came next. Yet beneath that composed exterior lived ordinary doubts they had never shown you. Could they communicate honestly when things became difficult? Could they stop retreating whenever feelings became intense? Could they offer you consistency instead of beautiful moments followed by confusing silence? Those questions had followed them into quiet evenings, into unfinished messages, into every conversation where they almost confessed everything and then decided to wait for a better time. But tonight something felt different. They looked again at what they had written and realized that waiting until they became perfectly fearless would mean waiting forever. The truth didn't require perfection. It required honesty. And there was another detail hidden inside their hesitation. They had already started changing certain things about themselves because of what this connection had revealed. Not to become someone else for you, but because knowing you had forced them to notice where they had been emotionally standing still. That realization took them back to a recent afternoon when they had been alone in a familiar place, surrounded by ordinary sounds, when something unexpectedly reminded them of you. It wasn't a photograph or a dramatic message. It was a conversation happening nearby, two people laughing easily, speaking without calculation, comfortable enough to say exactly what they meant. Your soulmate had watched for only a moment before looking away, but one thought remained: why am I making something meaningful harder than it needs to be? That question followed them home. It returned when they saw your name on their phone. It returned when they considered reaching out and then stopped themselves again. And now, sitting in the dim light with tears drying on their face, they understood the answer. Somewhere in their past, they had learned that showing less could feel safer than wanting more. So whenever you became important, that old instinct returned. Keep your expectations quiet. Don't reveal too much. Don't let someone see exactly where your heart is invested. But you had unknowingly challenged that entire pattern simply by being yourself. You had made them want a connection where silence wasn't constantly mistaken for strength. You had made them wonder whether being understood might feel better than being protected behind emotional walls. And suddenly the secret they had been crying over no longer seemed like something shameful that needed to remain hidden. It felt like a conversation waiting to happen. Their eyes returned to the message, and this time they deleted one line. Not because it was too revealing, but because it still sounded guarded. They replaced it with something simpler: I don't want you guessing anymore. Then they began writing what they actually wanted you to know. But the most unexpected shift happened before they finished. Their phone vibrated, and your soulmate instinctively glanced at the screen. Whatever appeared there made them sit completely still. For several seconds, they didn't type. They didn't wipe away the new tears gathering in their eyes. They simply read, then read again, as if the timing itself had caught them off guard. Something about that moment made all their carefully rehearsed explanations suddenly seem unnecessary. They looked at the long confession they had written and realized they didn't want their biggest truth delivered as a wall of text. They wanted you to hear their voice. To notice the pauses. To understand that if their words trembled, it wasn't uncertainty about you, it was the difficulty of finally saying aloud what they had spent so long hiding. They erased most of the message, leaving only a few words on the screen: can we talk? There is something I should have told you a long time ago. Their finger hovered again, but this time their expression had changed. There was still emotion there, but the fear was no longer controlling the moment. They pressed send. The message disappeared into the conversation, and suddenly there was nothing left to edit, nothing left to hide behind. Your soulmate placed the phone beside them and waited. Seconds stretched. Then the screen changed. They reached for it immediately, and what happened next made them realize that the secret they had been terrified to reveal might not be the truth that pushed you apart. It might be the truth that finally explained everything. The reply arrived so quickly that your soulmate almost wondered whether you had already been holding your phone when their message appeared. They opened it, expecting questions, confusion, maybe even the uncomfortable silence they had spent so long imagining, but the response was gentler than the scenario they had rehearsed 100 times in their mind. You weren't demanding an explanation. You weren't forcing the conversation forward. You were simply making space for it. And somehow, that kindness affected them more deeply than any dramatic reaction could have. They leaned back, closed their eyes, and released a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Then they called. The first few seconds carried that strange silence that happens when two people both know an ordinary conversation is about to become something much more meaningful. Your soulmate tried to begin casually, but their voice gave them away. "I don't really know how to say this," they admitted. Another pause. They looked toward the window, gathering courage from the darkness beyond it. "You probably thought there were times when I didn't care enough. The truth is, sometimes I cared so much that I didn't know how to act normally around it." Saying those words aloud changed something. There was no delete button now. No opportunity to rewrite the sentence until it sounded safer. And instead of retreating, they continued. They explained how often they had wanted to reach toward you, how frequently fear had disguised itself as distance, and how exhausting it had become to keep pretending the connection meant less than it did. Then came the line they had never planned to say tonight: "I wasn't afraid you would see something bad in me. I was afraid you would see everything in me, and then I'd have something real to lose." After that sentence, neither of you rushed to fill the silence. And in that quiet space, your soulmate discovered the answer they had been searching for wasn't hidden inside some perfect response from you. It was hidden inside their own willingness to remain present after finally becoming vulnerable. Normally, this would have been the exact moment when they changed the subject, made a joke, or found some graceful way to retreat. Tonight they stayed. They told you about the future they had secretly pictured. Not as a promise carved in stone, but as a possibility they had been too nervous to admit. They described simple things, conversations that didn't need an excuse to begin, ordinary days that somehow felt different because you were part of them, being able to tell you when something mattered instead of expecting you to decode their silence. Their voice softened as they admitted, "I kept thinking I needed certainty before I could be honest with you. But maybe honesty is how two people discover what's actually possible." That was the secret in its clearest form. Your soulmate had been crying because their feelings had grown beyond the carefully controlled space they had created for them, and admitting that meant accepting that no one can completely control what happens after opening their heart. If you've stayed with this story because something about that emotion feels meaningful, you can leave a comment with what stood out to you, share it with someone who enjoys stories like this, and subscribe if you'd like to be here for another one. Because the conversation wasn't finished yet. Your soulmate still had one thing to tell you, something they hadn't even included in the long message they almost sent. Their hand tightened gently around the phone as they stood and began pacing again, but this time the movement wasn't nervous, it carried the energy of someone finally reaching the sentence everything else had been leading toward. "There's one more thing," they said. Their voice became quieter. "I need you to know why tonight happened." And then they explained that the tears weren't simply about keeping a secret from you. They were about realizing how much time they had spent preparing for an ending that hadn't even happened instead of being fully present for the connection that actually existed. Every delayed conversation, every erased message, every moment of unnecessary distance had been built around imagined outcomes. Tonight, when someone challenged that pattern, your soulmates suddenly saw what it had been costing them. They didn't want to continue relating to you through possibilities they feared. They wanted to discover the truth with you, one honest conversation at a time. "I can't tell you exactly where this goes," they said, "but I can tell you I don't want fear making my decisions anymore." And then there was another silence, but this one felt entirely different. Warm. Open. almost weightless. Your soulmate looked down and realized they were smiling through the last traces of tears. The secret was no longer locked inside them. Nothing had collapsed. The world hadn't changed.